Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Well, the question is not whether Canada should do more trade with China. The question is, how do we do it without damaging our own economy or stepping on the toes of some of the provincial premiers? Let me explain. We already, by the way, do trade with China. I know some people are suggesting that, well, yeah, they're the bad guys and we have to really kind of shove off, and there's some bad blood and some bad taste in our mouths still from past deals with China. Remember Huawei arresting the president of Huawei, of course, at the behest of the U.S. government, and all the crap that the Canadians and the two Michaels had to go through. Notwithstanding all of that, which is still important, by the way, we still do trade with China. China is Canada's second largest trading partner. We always talk about Canada and the U.S., and we're, the U.S. big deal, and Canada sends so much down to the States, but we sent a lot to China too. And we don't want to forget about that, because that's very important. Because if we do want to, and we do want to, start to reduce the amount of trade we do with the United States, not eliminate it, by the way, as some of the conservative critics are saying. You said you were going to eliminate it, you're still buying this. We still trade with the United States. Let's not be stupid about this, guys, okay? But to do that, we're going to have to increase trade in other areas. And some of the conversations Prime Minister Carney has talked about are going to be beneficial. Places like Indonesia and things like that, that all matters, okay? Because, a bunch of little things add up to big stuff. But the two big areas that they're going to have to concentrate on are the European Union, and Carney's already made some huge inroads there, and China, increasing trade with China. Now, that may make some people feel uncomfortable, and I can understand that, as we'll explain in just a couple of minutes, but it absolutely has to happen. As I mentioned, we still do a lot of trade with China right now, always have, resource-based stuff like this. Well, about canola, and we're going to talk about that in just a couple of minutes, but also coal, petroleum products, and, of course, there's a great deal of acrimony, shall we say, between Canada and China these days about steel and steel imports, too, and that's going to play a factor in this. Now, when Prime Minister Carney was in the United Nations in New York over the last couple of days, he did talk with the Chinese president, because we're not in a trade war with China, but there are some major disagreements, of course. We talked about canola and steel and Chinese EVs. And it all comes down into one big pot here that's going to have to be dealt with. And it's going to have to be done, as we mentioned, very delicately. The major point here, because we've talked about some of the other things, but let's boil this down to the two major aspects of this. The canola oil, and Premier of Saskatchewan, Scott Moe, has been very ticked off about that, and we can understand that. But also the 100% tariff that Canada put on Chinese EVs some time ago. And that's got the Chinese government pretty pissed off, as you might expect. Now, we said we did that because at the time these were imposed, and this goes way back to when Trudeau was still the prime minister, that we found some unfair practices with protectionism and some other things, and flooding of markets with other Chinese goods. So this was kind of a retaliatory tariff. Some would suggest, though, that the reason the Canadian government did that is under pressure from the American government, which had already imposed a tariff on Chinese EVs. And we were kind of told, it'd be a pretty good idea if you followed suit, if you know what I mean. So I don't know if it's one or the other, probably a little bit of both. But the fact is, tariffs are in existence. The Chinese don't like it. And the canola, 100% tariff on canola and other agricultural goods, was a retaliatory tariff towards us. And it's hurting this economy. We know that. The prime minister knows that, which is one of the reasons why he had these conversations with the Chinese prime minister over the last couple of days while they were in New York. Because this is a big industry for the Chinese, as you might expect. I can still remember back in the radio show days of having discussions with a number of Canadian economists about the Chinese auto industry, which was in its fledgling days back in the 20, 25 years ago, I guess. And apparently the product was pretty crappy. People said, they're not really going to be much of a factor, really. But the smart economists that we brought on the show had said, look, give them time, because they learn. And I've talked to people that are in the industry, and the North American auto industry, that said, look, these guys know how to improve products. Sometimes they do it for, espionage, industrial espionage. There's a whole lot of stuff. I had a good friend of mine who was a member of the Canadian auto industry. He was in the design part of different cars for different manufacturers. And he said the number one rule, he says, and every time you go over to China on a trade mission or to talk about it, he says, keep your briefcase locked because stuff has been known to be lifted from or photographed or whatever the case might be. However they got the information, the Chinese auto industry has grown and it's a player, and Canadians know that, and the Canadian government knows that, and the Chinese government was really bothered by the fact that they're not being shut out, but really they're curtailed with their involvement in the U.S. and Canadian auto purchases now because of the tariffs that are in place. So they want to see those removed. And certainly here in Canada, many people in the agricultural industry want to see the tariffs, the 100% tariffs on things like canola and pork and seafood and some other things like that, also removed. So that's the problem, and that's what the Prime Minister is trying to address right now. And they did make some progress. I mean, they had some talks about this, and the fact that they're talking is first thing has to happen, right? You can't come to a deal if you're not talking to anybody. So they have decided to set up a joint conference between the two countries and try to resolve their differences. Now, that sounds on paper like what a great idea. Sure, let's do that. Let's get the tariffs off of the canola so that the agricultural industry can start to thrive, because again, it's another area where we don't need to be as reliant on the United States. But that may come with a price, because for them to remove those canola tariffs, Canada's going to have to do something about the tariffs on EVs. It's 100% right now. In other words, really kind of parroting what the United States government did with the Chinese government with the EVs, the Chinese EVs. Do we eliminate the tariff altogether? Do we reduce the tariff? Is that going to be enough for the Chinese government? These are all questions that we don't know the answers to at this stage, but those are very much going to be some of the topics of conversation. Do we meet them halfway, and do they maintain tariffs on canola? Is that going to be enough for the Canadian economy, the agricultural sector of this? They'd like to see them removed altogether. I think everybody, it's ironic, isn't it, as we've had these discussions over the last couple of years now about tariffs and the impact that they have on economies, and trade agreements, in some cases free trade agreements that are being drawn up between countries and jurisdictions. And all the political leaders are saying, yeah, we'd like to have those tariffs removed altogether. It's really going to help trade. But at the same time, they're the ones that are imposing them on each other. So there's a contradiction of terms here that it boggles the imagination and boggles the mind sometimes. But it is what it is, and we're going to have to stick handle around those. And I don't know how delicately they can do that in this situation, because the Chinese demands are going to be pretty strong here. Now, I know the Prime Minister has already said that he is open to the discussion about the Chinese tariffs on Chinese EVs, I should say. And that's send another set of problems onto the Prime Minister's plate. And that, of course, is the Canadian auto industry. All right. If they remove those tariffs, and if all of a sudden a number of Chinese EVs and manufacturers start to move that into the Canadian product and into the Canadian economy, what does that do to the Ontario industry, especially? I mean, now, the auto industry, a lot of the time, is centered here in Ontario, in southern Ontario, but it's not singularly. I mean, there are sections of the auto sector, the Canadian auto sector, in other parts of the country as well. And they're concerned about the impact that extra Chinese EVs into the market are going to have here. Are we going to stop buying, North American-made cars or even imported cars from Asia and start moving more towards Chinese cars? Because, let's face it, if they're cheaper and you have to buy an EV, you're going to try to find the best deal. These things are not cheap to begin with, right? They're not inexpensive. And the subsidies, for the most part, have been removed now. They've either expired, or some provinces, of course, have never even given them. So it's going to be very daunting. And that's one of the realities that our government is facing right now. It's kind of a double-barreled situation here. In the first place, because EV sales have never really reached the stage where the industry wanted them to be and the government wanted them to be. Now there's some consideration by this government to say maybe we need to relax some of those standards and some of those benchmarks that have been set for the production of EVs and the sale of EVs, because they're just not going to attain them. That's all there is to it. Now, they can even leave them in place, but they're going to be penalized for it. And the auto industry, this is not Donald Trump that's saying get rid of those EV standards. It's the Canadian auto industry that's saying, look, we can't do this. We were there for you. We were there for the ribbon cuttings and the announcements about EVs and producing batteries here and everything else. And 4 years ago, it sounded like a great idea, but it just hasn't panned out for a variety of reasons. Some of it is because of tariffs, but there are other factors as well. The production's not there. The infrastructure for EVs, charging stations, etc., battery production is not where they thought it was going to be at this stage, and that all plays into the decision here. So will the government relax those standards and give the auto sector here a break? Because if they don't, the auto sector says, look, we're just going to close more plants then and lay off more people because we're not going to be able to produce them. They can say, okay, we'll build all the EVs and they're going to be, by 2035 or 2036 or 2030. We'll meet those standards. But they don't want to build cars. They're just going to be sitting on the lot someplace because nobody's buying them. I mean, that makes no sense at all. It's economic disaster to do that sort of thing. So there has to be a market and there has to be accessibility and affordability for these things. So the Chinese are saying, hey, we can do that. But what's going to happen to the auto industry here in Ontario and in other parts of the country? Do they continue to lay people off because Canadian consumers may be more inclined to buy Chinese products as opposed to what is already going to be available to them? We don't know yet. It's not an easy issue. This is the thing that I guess we've all talked about and come to discover. We're learning a lot more about economics than probably any of us ever wanted to, but we understand now how important a part it plays in our everyday lives, even if you're not in the auto industry. Even if you're not even in the steel industry, we all know now that what happens there has an impact on our lives. Because if the steel industry is suffering, then all of a sudden, people are being laid off. That hurts local economies. They don't have as much money to spend. And there's a cyclical thing that's happening here that we need to be aware of. And I think, obviously, our prime minister is aware of that, but so are other world leaders right now. So that's always something that we have to consider. It's one thing to say, here's the deal. But what's the fallout? What are the ramifications of that deal down the road? And what's it going to do to one part of the country as opposed to the other? And I'll use the Chinese thing as a classic example. Scott Moe has already been to China to plead his case to the Chinese officials to say, please drop the tariffs on canola. And they basically said, yeah, you do something about the EVs on Chinese vehicles, and maybe we've got ourselves a deal. Then you got Doug Ford in Ontario that say, whoa. You do that with Chinese EVs, and that's going to kill or at least hamper and cause a lot of problems in the auto industry in Ontario, and that's going to have an impact on the Ontario economy. So it's kind of a push and pull thing, and the government has to weigh the implications of both and say, okay, what's the best deal here? So this is not a simple process, and it's going to take some negotiation. Which, by the way, is something I also want to touch on for just a couple of seconds here. I mean, I've talked about on the podcast before about Poilievre and, the talking head who really has no idea what he's talking about. And he's been critical of the prime minister for what he calls, globe trotting, going all over the world, flying here, flying there at great expense to the Canadian taxpayer, he says, and coming back with absolutely nothing. Well, first of all, the latter part is also BS. He's come back with agreements with Ireland this week, certainly with the UK, with Asian countries, and even meeting with the Chinese while he was in New York at the United Nations thing. But you don't come back with a deal. That stuff that we've seen Donald Trump, we just talked in 20 minutes later with the EU and we've got our deal. No, they don't have a deal. They may have had an agreement on some ideas, but there is no deal. There's no paper to say, this is the deal. This is what happens here. This is what happens here. It took months to negotiate the first Canada-U.S. free trade. And of course, the Mexican government got involved in that. Months of negotiations, back and forth. Sometimes negotiations work out. The renewed deal, the Kuzma deal that we're talking about these days, between the first Trump administration, also took months and months to negotiate. And they already had a template to work with. These things do not happen overnight. And you know what? Poilievre knows that. He's just being stupid and trying to play, to the Canadian voters. And I like to think that we're smarter than that, just fall for that kind of crap from Poilievre. He's not going to come back with a signed deal on anything right now. But you start the negotiations and the discussions, and then you come back with a deal. And that's what's happening here. And he's done that in the number of months that Carney has been in office. Look at the contacts that he has made, or the contacts that he has strengthened with some of our existing partners, whether it's European, Scandinavian, and certainly what's happening in Asia, and now with China. These are very important discussions to be had. And you don't get the deal, you don't get to the finish line until you start the race. And he's starting the race. So what's going to happen with China? Well, we'll find out in hopefully not too long a time, because time is of the essence here too, because this is having a negative impact on the Canadian economy, and that can't go on forever either. So how, though, do we do what needs to be done, increasing trade with China, but at the same time, we don't shoot ourselves in the foot economically when it comes to the impact that any sort of a deal that we're going to get with China is going to have on other facets of the economy too? It's a delicate process, and we haven't even talked about the elephant in the room right now, which is the orange elephant in the room, which is if we do what we're supposed to do here and what we are intending to do by increasing trade with China and the European Union for that matter, and decreasing our trade with the United States, not eliminating it, but decreasing it, how's Trump going to respond? We already know that by his track record more recently, he just imposes more tariffs on the goods that are already there. That's a risk. We don't know how he's going to respond. Usually not well, and usually not with any common sense, because he doesn't have any common sense. But you always have to do these negotiations and these deals with that knowledge that the crazy man in the White House is probably going to respond in some way, shape, or form. And how he does that and what impact that's going to have on Canada also has to be factored into any of these decisions. Not an easy process, not an easy task for the Prime Minister. But he's not sitting here wringing his hands saying this is impossible. He's doing something about it. And that's something that which we really have to hang on to right now. So good luck to our Prime Minister, and we'll certainly follow these stories as those negotiations and those discussions continue. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Great to have you with us on the podcast. If you're on YouTube, hit that notification bell, please, and pass this on, and we will share the conversation with others. And thank you again, as we've talked about over the last little while, thank you for those that are hitting the subscribe button as well. Lots to go on here, and it's important that we have information and dialogue back and forth about these matters, and your subscriptions and your support to the podcast really helps us to be able to do that. Thanks to Madeline Kelly for the work putting this one together, as always. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.